So big welcome to tonight's webinar on the New Zealand Medicinal Cannabis Referendum. I'm Paul Mavor, I'm the Chief Pharmacist from Health House International. And by way of disclaimer, we're not here promoting cannabis. If you think you may need to take it medically, then please have a private discussion about your situation with your trained medical professional. So a couple of months back, pre-COVID, I literally had my bags packed and we're on the way to the airport for New Zealand's first medicinal cannabis conference. I was super excited to attend MedCan. And at that time, a very wise Jacinda Ardern announced the lockdown restrictions and a 14-day quarantine. Next day, Australia announced the same thing. So luckily we didn't travel and the conference was delayed, but it will be happening later this year, I believe in November at this stage. I'm really excited to attend and fingers crossed we'll be able to travel in our own little COVID-safe bubble. I've never been to New Zealand, but I'm super keen to visit our beautiful neighbour and smash around some hot springs in a high-speed boat while sipping some Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc while the sun sets over Middle-earth. And I had got ulterior motives. I really wanted to know more about the impending referendum. So I put together this webinar, and I think if successful, it will almost certainly have major repercussions here in Australia. And it's happening at New Zealand's next general election on Saturday, September 19. And it's one of two referendum questions, the other one being the End of Life Choice Act. And I think this is quite significant because there's plenty of Australian palliative care patients taking medicinal cannabis to improve their quality of life. Now, the proposed legislation, I'm not going to bore you with the full lot, but there is you'll be able to Google and find the full text of it online, but I'm just going to run through a few key points, and I think they're relatively sensible and straightforward. The minimum purchase of cannabis under the proposed new laws and possession age is 20 years old, so i.e. excluding children, and an eligible person can purchase up to 14 grams of dried cannabis or its equivalent each day. And they will be looking at allowing home grow up to 2 plants per person or 4 plants per household. There is a proposed ban on marketing and advertising of cannabis products, and also a requirement to include harm minimisation messaging on the actual packaging the same way as they do with cigarettes and alcohol. Smoking of cannabis or using cannabis won't be able to be used in public. It is for private homes and licensed premises, and only in compliance with certain smoke-free environment legislation that's currently in force for tobacco. Sales will be limited to physical stores, i.e. no online sales, and there'll be controls over the potency as well of cannabis being sold. So you won't get massive amounts of THC. It will be regulated, and I'm not sure the levels, but that will all be controlled and be tested for, which is quite important because while it's easy to grow cannabis, you need to exclude harmful things like pesticides and heavy metals. And they're looking at establishing an authority to govern all this. And in the event of a yes vote, it is non-binding, and there's one of the parties, I believe, excited to find out more about it, but the National Party, apparently they haven't committed to enacting the result if they win the 2020 election. So right now I'm going to show you the for and the against video. The for video is quite stylish. This is the no video. Sharing it now.
On September 19th, we have the choice to make cannabis legal.
But what we're really voting for is to do this our way.
And on our terms.
Not in Canada's, or the Netherlands, or wherever.
But on New Zealand's terms.
Terms that we all feel make sense for us, for our nation.
Terms that could give those who could benefit from medicinal treatment much better access.
That will generate funding for nationwide health and education. That'll give our police more time to focus on important things like violent crime.
But also on the terms that there'll be much safer potency levels.
It won't be allowed in public spaces.
And it will remain absolutely illegal for anyone under 20.
That's why I'm voting yes.
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 On our terms.
On our terms.
So check them out at onourterms.org.nz.
So that's quite a stylish video, as you can see, and I think it's reasonably well done. Sorry, just gonna...
In this video, we'll show you how to add.
So right now I'm going to play the no video. This is the last minute. It's actually quite long, so I'm not going to bore you with a whole lot. You can find it on YouTube, but this is the last minute or so of their campaign.
And I ended up getting drug-induced psychosis. I thought, because I was studying neuroscience and psychology, that I could control what was going on. Didn't understand how deeply addicted I was and how damaging this was until it was too late, until I had started hearing things and seeing things that weren't real, and until I was depressed and anxious and pushing people away from me that I shouldn't have, dropping out of university and things like that. There is significant harm in marijuana. I know that from my own life. I know that from the lives of other people. I've seen it directly. If we legalise for recreational use, you're going to get an increase of people smoking weed, and no doubt about it. And you're also going to get an increase of mental health problems to do something so counterproductive in the name of, because everyone else is, everyone smokes weed, we might as well make it legal. It's like, that's stupidity at its extreme, really.
And that's the no campaign as well. So I'll just jump back. So the no campaign, there's two separate videos, and they highlight two individuals, Jake and Vincent, and both are quite well spoken, and they claim cannabis to have messed up their life, and they started at using it quite heavily around about the university, high school age. But I personally, I think some of the legislation addresses some of this harm with regards to making it safe and accessible. I know cannabis is one of the most widely accessible of the illicit drugs for recreation. So from a harm minimisation point of view, it's relatively low on the addiction scale. And it's probably better that they're using tested cannabis of known potency rather than street quality cannabis that they obtain from their dealer, which could potentially lead to a gateway drug, which they told their story from where cannabis was banned. So assuming in a legal system, it will be more under the spotlight. One would hope anyway. So, and some of these companies that are licensed, they wouldn't want to put their license at risk by having super high THC quantities in their products or other nasties in there. So from a medical point of view, I'm a big fan of the Australian medical system, and I think we've done it the right way. And my major concern with some of the legislation, and I want to find out more about what the other speakers tonight, their take on it, but will it negatively impact the medical system, and will doctors be less likely to prescribe medical cannabis because it's available, recreationally? So I really look forward to hearing what some of the other speakers have to say about that. That's all from me. I'll hand you over to Dunya. She's going to introduce the other speakers, but just a reminder, if you do have any questions about tonight's webinar, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for that lovely intro. That was a good recap as well, both sides. So our next speaker, I'll introduce Shane LeBrun. He is the chairperson of the Medicinal Cannabis Awareness New Zealand charity. So his ambitions are to improve patient situations within the rules and the politics of New Zealand, and he will cover how the campaign is shaping up for New Zealand. So Shane, happy to hand it over.
Thanks very much. So in New Zealand, we're just starting off with the basics of it. We'll just go through the political side and the parties involved and the organisations going for and against the referendum, and also how the actual public support is tracking at the moment. So on that note, I'll just go to share my screen. Right. So this is how things look in Parliament at the moment. And with the referendum now less than 100 days away, it's important to highlight how little support there is within Parliament for this. So in the Labour Party, the referendum was part of a bargaining with the Greens and New Zealand First to get into power. And New Zealand First in particular is always keen on referendums for hot button issues where they want to dodge responsibility. And the Greens were all for legalisation. So the compromise between Labour playing referee with the New Zealand First and the Greens was to agree to put legalisation of cannabis to a referendum. So that's what we have coming up. So in Parliament, Labour, perhaps a half to 2/3 of the politicians are in support, but most of them are keeping tight-lipped and not campaigning for it. But the Greens are all for it, and the little yellow dot up there is ACT. Now, ACT is a libertarian party that gets a lot of fiscal conservatives voting for them. So while they're very much in support of legalisation, they won't say it publicly because it'll offend their voting base in Epsom. And in the National Party, there are some reformers within the party, but as a whole, they are generally quite conservative on social issues. So, you know, they were the last to roll over and accept gay marriage and that sort of thing. So on the politicians front, you see in the top left, that is former deputy leader of the National Party, Paula Bennett. So she's their drug policy spokesperson, and she's been meeting with the Say Nope to Dope crowd and even hosting Alex Berenson at Parliament, which is a bit of a no-no. You know, he's a drug policy equivalent of a flat earther. And she's also met with some people that have been organised from overseas, such as experts out of Portugal, and they've come away from meetings with her with pretty low expectations of where the National Party sits on drug law reform. The image in the top right is Chloe Swarbrick, and she's the young rising star in the Green Party. So she just got in on the list at the last election, and I think in the last week or two, she's been bumped up to number 3 on the Green Party list. So for her advocacy on drug policy and mental health, she's basically as high as she can get without actually already being a deputy leader of that party. And the other image there, we've got Andrew Little. Now, he's actually the architect of this referendum and the draft regulations that have gone in behind it. For those of you who follow New Zealand politics, he was actually the leader of the Labour Party up until a few months before the last election. And basically the support for Labour was getting spanked, and he stepped down to give Jacinda Ardern a shot. And that's how the political fortunes of Labour have turned around. And he's probably more popular now that he's not leader than when he was. So he's been a very effective politician in the Labour Party. And he's put a lot of effort over the last few years into the referendum and the draft regulations. His Ministry of Justice team in particular had a lot more resources early on than the Ministry of Health did for their medical cannabis scheme. So there's actually, particularly in 2018, there was a lot more manpower being put into the referendum than there was into the medical cannabis scheme that Labour had committed to putting into place. So if we go to the next slide, we've actually got the tracking of public support. And fundamentally, things are pretty dicey at the moment. For a big block of 2019, it seemed like the referendum was a sure thing. But from about mid last year onwards, support for some reason tanked. And we think that may have been due to the fact that the medical cannabis scheme seemed to have been over and it was resolved and it had passed through Parliament. However, the support has been up and down since, and just in the latest poll, it looked like support was just above the naysayers. But irrespective of where things are, they seem to be trading up and down sort of 5 to 10 percentage points. There's a good core block of about 20% of New Zealand that's in the undecided camp. And then we have the campaigners who are trying to go for this undecided block because they're the low-hanging fruit to swing the vote either way. And the first one, which you saw in that ad before, is Family First. So they have multiple brands. They're headed up by a guy, Bob McCroskey. They seem to be an organization, but it's really a one-man band. It's all about Bob. And they're socially conservative. The charities office has tried to strip their charitable status on multiple occasions. They campaign against not just drug law reform, but they campaign against euthanasia, abortion, smacking your kids or not being able to smack your kids, gay marriage, and that sort of thing. And as you saw, they have a bit of a marketing campaign. In addition to the 2 videos that they have online, they have done some cheap billboards in the South Island late last year. So they're sort of warming up to our campaign. And they talk about big cannabis and that sort of thing and preying on those fears. But I actually think Andrew Little's draft regulations is kind of put paid to the big corporate overlord angle because it does cut that commercial aspect quite far down. But one of the other things they have, so in addition to Family First controlling Say No to Dope, they've just spawned a new organization that doesn't even have a website or a registered body, but it seems to be they have a dream team of people to come out and campaign for the no vote. But looking at it, it seems to be a lot of religious folk, some drug policy and drug testing agencies, and even some organisations, and they're a bit misrepresented. So there's the Sensible Sentencing Trust, which lost its charitable status because they are just too far out there. And there's a couple of trusts that aren't actually trusts, they're limited liability companies. And they've even got MethCon in there, which is quite interesting because that was founded by a former national MP, where if you look up his name, you'll see there's 24 redacted articles by Google because he's under name suppression for offences that can't be, well, it'd be a crime for me to say what they are. On the positive side of the campaign, we've actually got an overarching organisation called Health Not Handcuffs. So that was started by the Drug Foundation, and they created an alliance of other charities, including mine, that are campaigning for the yes vote. And the Drug Foundation's headed up by Ross Bell, and it was quite significant in 2018 with all the drug law reform that was going on in New Zealand. He was widely picked by pundits as one of the top political winners of 2018. So even though he wasn't in Parliament, he had much more of a positive effect, and his organisation did, than some of the backbench MPs. Because in 2018, there was the saga in New Zealand of the meth contamination in houses. There's the decriminalisation bill that got through, as well as the medical cannabis bill. So I won't cover the ad but I've got a good website. Basically, with the focus groups and stuff that Health Not Handcuffs and the Drug Foundation did, they're focusing on some key aspects that would sway voters. And one of the big ones is the degree of control that the bill puts forward. So the issues around R20 and increasing penalties to supplying to minors, the regulations around drugs driving and that sort of thing, that's a really important issue that swings votes. The other organisation that's around is Make It Legal, and they are, they've got a few Green MPs or former Green MPs, some of the founders of Normal New Zealand, and they've been quite active on social media and with banners and billboards around the country. And they're certainly picking up a lot of traction lately. They've been getting some of the celebrities in New Zealand to get in behind the Make It Legal campaign. So not just Israel Adesanya here, but one of the others, they even got a former All Black, which is, like God in the New Zealand sense. So Ben Franks here actually has his own CBD company selling nutritional supplements in the UK. And that's one of the angles they're going for, is to get more and more celebrities out in support of the vote as well. And arguably, they're a bit, up until these ads came out from our Choice campaign, Make It Legal was probably more prominent and publicly visible in New Zealand. And I'll leave that there.
Thanks so much. All right. So our next speaker is Dr. Mark Hardy. He's the medical director of the Cannabis Access Clinics, and he'll provide a bit of a medical insight from an addiction specialist and prescriber angle on recreational cannabis. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks very much, Dunya. So look, thanks for having me come along today. First of all, I think when we break down the burden of disease for drug and alcohol, that's all drug and alcohol in a community like Australia, which has a very similar cannabis use prevalence to New Zealand. What we see is about 16.5% of all burden of all disease, that is motor accidents, heart attacks, lung cancer, strokes, and drug and alcohol. 16.5% of all burden of disease is drug and alcohol. Most of that, probably 7/8 of that, is alcohol and tobacco. And about 1/8 of that, so around about 2.3%, is illicit drug use, of which about 8% of that 2.3, or about 0.16% can be directly attributable to cannabis. So what we're saying is that not only is cannabis 0.16% of the burden of disease in the Australian community, and this is from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, it means that it's only about 1% of the total drug and alcohol burden of disease. So in fact, what we see is 99% of the burden of disease is from other things such as alcohol, tobacco, opioids, methamphetamine, stimulants, cocaine, injecting injuries, other accoutrements that go with using drugs, acquiring drugs, dispensing with drugs, etc., etc. Of course, the question arises, what are the harms? What are the harms that come with using it? Of course, there are inhalation of toxins, which we hope will largely be circumvented through the legislation. Loss of function, functional capacity, people losing motivation, people having mood changes or psychological changes, loss of access or loss of agency to moving towards a medical utilisation program. But the main one that keeps coming up, and you can see in that very emotive second commercial, for the No campaign, the initial No campaign case study was psychosis. So I guess the question is, what are the determinant factors of psychosis, and what was the sort of prevalence that we see? The main sort of determinant factors that we see in terms of what makes psychosis likely or unlikely, severe or not severe, are the percentage of THC, the frequency of use, and the age of first use. And sometimes that's not all. Obviously, high dose, heavy use of strong product on its own doesn't affect some people. Other people who have a disorder of one gene in their DNA called the COMT gene, if that defect is present, then they are much more likely to develop a psychosis on cannabis than normal populations that have the normal gene. A study in Europe, done over a typical European study, very longitudinal from 94 to mid-2016, the prevalence of psychosis in cannabis users was between 2.8 at the lowest year to a maximum of 6.1 per 100,000 users. And that's a study that was released last year. So psychosis due to cannabis is exceedingly rare. Coming back again to determinants of addiction and harm, what are the likely determinants of harm and addiction? The same sorts of things we see with alcohol, and this is why we have licensing ages for alcohol. Age of first use, cost and availability. Now, obviously, age of first use with cannabis set at 20 is higher than alcohol, but there is going to be some concerns from the community in regards to increased availability of cannabis. And this was obviously going to be played into very strongly by the No campaign, and something that the Yes campaign will be trying to quarantine, if you like, pardon the ISO pun, but they will be trying to quarantine the argument around availability. And of course, the other thing is cost. So people can grow their own at home. They can basically get very, very inexpensive cannabis. So there are some concerns from an addiction medicine point of view around the potential for uptake of cannabis use in a legalised society. Now, this has not been reflected so much in societies overseas, where the people who smoke cannabis continue to smoke cannabis, and the people who don't smoke cannabis continue to desist from smoking cannabis. So if we look at the arguments for and against, the main arguments for would be things around decriminalising drug use. It would be a shame to see one's child or grandchild unable to get a job because of a criminal record, unable to get a passport to certain countries because they had a criminal record, and the basis of that record was use of cannabis. Other things that are pros for the government are things like control of the substance and control of the percentages, taxation and excise, control of the scenarios in which people can use. That this is, in terms of on a more societal basis, of what we might consider a low acuity drug, given the psychosis rates with cannabis use disorder, as I've just said earlier. And it's probably consistent with current use patterns and current mental health patterns internationally. In fact, the studies that I've quoted are pretty much, apart from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, all been international work. Okay, so what are the cons? There aren't too many cons, but there are a couple, of course, to this. The rare sentinel events, of course, are going to be played on by the media and have already. There is a potential for a loss in the medicinal space of people going through a monitoring process, ensuring that the doses of CBD versus THC are in balance. It's fair to say, though, that to some degree, everyone who comes for a medicinal cannabis consultation undergoes an assessment, and then there is this period of empirical trialing of various doses and strengths, in much the same way that no doubt people who grow their own or purchase their own may well be in a position or disposed to doing exactly the same thing. However, there won't be a medicinal element to it. There won't be a medical supervision element to that. That may be argued against it. And this slow leaking of legislation may be another argument put against the medicinal, sorry, against the illicit cannabis group. In that some people will consider this the first step to having people smoking in the street. And this is, again, a strategy that may be thrown straight at the pro campaign. That, you know, this is only just the beginning, guys. We're going to see so much more down the track. I guess in summary, as an addiction specialist, having actually lived those statistics that I've had to work with in a professional career spanning over 30 years, working with people with addictions, that most of the harms that I've seen from addiction have not come from cannabis. In fact, the cannabis-related harms have been exceedingly rare. That the drug, whilst it's often touted as a gateway drug, is often seen as almost a side gate drug. So the people who progress through stronger and stronger drugs would or may have likely to have done that, regardless of whether or not cannabis factored much in their drug use career. And that when we look at the current criminalisation of cannabis use, it's an intolerable situation as a father to see my adult children potentially exposed to the risk of loss of the joy of freedom to travel, the loss of joy of freedom to get jobs in any particular pursuit that they would like, simply because they made a choice to smoke a drug which was currently rendered illegal, but which had the potential, because of international legislation, to not be so, to be a legal drug. So I'll hand it back now.
Thanks, Dr. Hardy. All right, so I'll just hand over to our fourth speaker for tonight. It's Manu, who's part of the Kaihautu Innovation and Regulation and the co-founder of Rua Bioscience. So it's ideal to cover the industry aspect, the community perspective, and the positive aspects of the New Zealand legislation. Hi, Manu, thanks for joining us.
Sure, good evening. I'll just try and share my screen. Yeah, so I thought I'd just quickly give you a bit of background about our company. We're located on the east coast of the North Island, in a very rural, remote part of the country, a little village really called Ruatoria. It's about 800 residents. It's about 2 hours from the nearest town of 35,000 people. Yeah, it has a long history of growing cannabis for the illicit market and supplying other parts of the country. So about 2016, a few of us locally got together and were looking at economic development opportunities for our community, job creation opportunities. And while we were looking at some native plants and have some projects that are carrying on with that, someone suggested we look at growing hemp, which was being used for seed production, obviously, and potentially fibre. So we got a license, we planted some, and weren't quite sure what we were going to use it for. But by the time we harvested in March 2017, we'd sort of done our homework and decided to focus on medicinal cannabis. We could see the way that the regulations and legislation was heading in New Zealand as well as globally, and that seemed to be the opportunity to create jobs, and so we pursued that. And there was quite a lot of interest from our community. We were able to fundraise, and we've found some other investors since, and really focusing on that pharmaceutical GMP product, building facilities now that are due to open in the next couple of weeks. The extraction facility there opens next week, and we've been doing indoor cultivation, also outdoor cultivation, looking at both really high quality flower as well as broad acre for extractions and formulations. So we're very focused on medicinal. Recreational's not in our sights, but because of the background of the company, we really the company board has considered it for quite a while and has recently come to the position of supporting the yes vote. It's again not something that we're planning to get into ourselves. We've got a very clear business plan around the pharmaceutical products, but from that harm prevention perspective and from the social justice perspective, we think that the only ethical position that anyone can really have is support for the yes vote. And there's also quite a lot of support in our community that founded the company for those illicit growers who are going to find that their income that many rely on at the moment potentially dries up under a legal system, but they're quite keen on being able to continue growing without having to look over their shoulder, without having to worry about dad being taken off to prison for a couple of years, and to be able to do what they love doing, but in a legal system. So for those reasons, we're supporting the yes vote. But as I say, not planning to get into it ourselves. But because of the infrastructure and the expertise that we've developed around medicinal, there's quite a lot of that knowledge that can be transferred to some of those local growers to support them into their own cultivation activities. So just recapping again, for those that missed it, the purpose of the bill is very much around harm reduction, and has a lot of controls around it. So it's called the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill. And as others have alluded to, there's quite a lot in there to prevent some of those risks and harms that the no vote certainly worry about. And so there's just a list there of the kind of purpose that the government's outlined. Some interesting stuff from an industry perspective in the bill itself. There's a strong emphasis on trying to address the harms that have been caused by cannabis, and it uses that in a general sense, but if you read between the lines, a lot of it's about cannabis prohibition as opposed to cannabis causing harm in and of itself. As Mark said, actually the risks are pretty low compared to most other drugs. And so interestingly, we've got the luxury, I suppose, in New Zealand of looking around the world and seeing what has and hasn't worked so far in those jurisdictions that have legalised, particularly in North America. And so we've taken, I think that the officials have taken the best of that and looked at what they can do to create a really world-class legalisation regime. And so there's a big emphasis in there on this idea of trying to use the legislation not only to prevent harm, but to actually support those communities that have been harmed by prohibition. And so the way the licenses are going to be issued for cultivation, there's a good proportion of it, or the the entity that issues the licenses has to take into account the sort of social impact and the representation and participation of Māori as Indigenous peoples that have been disproportionately affected, as well as other communities from economically deprived areas in the allocation of those licenses that are given out. So that's, again, there's been some attempts in places like California and Illinois, I think, to have this sort of equity licensing regime, but this is very explicit. And so, yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. So anyone applying for a license, if they want to be prioritised, needs to show how Māori are involved, or those that come from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition. So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And so just some kind of key issues from an industry perspective for those that may be interested in getting into it. There was some economic research done recently by an economic think tank in New Zealand that calculated their view is that it's probably worth about $500 million a year if the legal industry is established here. I think most of that was calculated before the draft bill was released, but the early indications when the sort of principles of the bill were released last year suggested that there would be quite a lot of control around it and it wasn't going to be a free-for-all. And so I think they've taken that into account, and so that's where they sort of landed. Colorado has probably a slightly more liberal regime than what's proposed in New Zealand. And they have an annual turnover now of around $2 billion for the legal market and about $500 million for medicinal, in a population that's just a little bit larger than New Zealand. And that's US dollars. So potentially that's probably the upside, the sort of the high estimate, and the conservative one might be around $500 million. There's a maximum of 20% of licenses, of the licensed production that can go to any one company. So they've tried to prevent monopoly development through that. And there's also, again, this sort of emphasis on small license holders or applicants need to be able to compete and get access to those licenses as much as any of the big ones. So how that works out in practice, the devil will be in the detail, but that's the intention of the legislation that's been drafted to date. Companies that are producing cannot also be in the distribution game. So you can't be a cultivator and a retailer. And that's going to, again, sort of help to distribute the benefits or opportunities as widely as possible in a legal industry. I've touched on the equity of outcomes in license allocations. There's no advertising. Basically, sort of sounds like plain packaging other than health warnings. And there's limits on potency. So I think it's 15% THC is the limit on products, which some people have thought is, it doesn't make sense. And there's, as others have touched on, very significant penalties if you do end up supplying or get caught supplying to minors or people under 20. There's also a limit of 2 plants per person or 4 plants per household for grow your own. No limit on how big those plants could be. So you can be growing Christmas trees. And I think there again, they'll probably need to tweak it. It probably needs to be flowering plants because you're going to need your cuttings and veg plants coming through as you go on. And one of the big issues, I think, for industry and for the regulators and for the public is this expectation that taxes on that industry will fund the regulation and also health and education services and information. And I think, again, sort of looking and learning from overseas jurisdictions, we've just got to be really careful there that the tax burden is not such that the legal products can't compete with the illicit market. Or one of the goals of this legislation is to try and replace the illicit market. And if it's too expensive, then people will continue to go to the illicit market and it won't achieve what it's trying to do. And then the other issue, I guess, from a medicinal cannabis perspective is that these products will be cheaper than pharmaceuticals. And we think that's a good thing. Our company isn't particularly focused on the New Zealand market for pharmaceutical medicinal cannabis. It's much more interested in the global opportunities. And we see, hearing from many patients that medicinal products are going to remain, that they're already very expensive and unaffordable for most patients and are going to remain so until there's proper subsidies. So there's a bit of a campaign that's brewing amongst some of the patients around, with the catchphrase, subsidise or legalise. And it's the way the subsidies for medicines work in New Zealand, it's a long way for any products to, other than some of those sort of Sativex and Epidiolex, before any products will be eligible. And again, it's sort of in the scheme of things for the medicines subsidies, medicinal cannabis is probably going to stay down the priority list for some time until we get some more evidence around the benefits of cannabis over some of the opioids and things. But the cost of production is always going to be quite expensive compared to synthetics. So here's a quick summary from an industry perspective.
Thanks so much, Manu. That was really good. All right, and I'll just introduce the lucky last speaker as well. So Rhys Cohen is a cannabis economist and the principal consultant at Fresh Leaf Analytics. And he's really well recognized here in Australia for the medicinal cannabis industry, so particularly understands that economic impact. So I'll introduce him to just summarize for us what that could mean for Australia and the collection of topics that we might have been ready tonight. Thanks, Rhys.
Thanks, Dunya, and thanks everybody. Can I just say, this has been one of the more interesting panel discussions I've had the privilege of participating in quite some time. So thanks everybody for your contributions. Fascinating stuff. I'm going to be really quick if I can, just because I really enjoy the Q&A segments of these kinds of events, and I would encourage everyone, if you have questions or a comment, to start writing that in the Q&A function now, so we can get through some interesting questions. I guess for me, I see this as quite an historical moment. I think, should New Zealand vote yes on this referendum, and should the legislation be passed, they would be the third country in the world to legalise non-medical recreational cannabis use at a federal level, since prohibition in the early 1900s. That's quite something, and we're still at the very early stages of this journey, globally speaking, I guess it would be fair to say. It's interesting, Shane, in particular, listening to your talk about how close we were to not even having this be on the agenda as far as a policy proposal goes. And that's worth remembering, especially for those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about and working within cannabis. I think we tend to get this idea that it's a lot more of a sure thing than it might actually be. And this referendum in September, I think, is sharpening people's focus and reminding us that actually this isn't a done deal. This is a contested policy arena that needs to be genuinely and constantly addressed in order for us to make any progress in the right direction. So interesting getting some perspectives there for sure. New Zealand would also be the first country in the world to legalise recreational cannabis via a referendum. It's an interesting method. It's one that's often used for contentious policy issues. New Zealand is also simultaneously with this proposal voting on voluntary assisted dying or euthanasia. So that reflects how hands-off some of the politicians would like to be with this issue. Everyone would rather it be left up to the general public and not have to wear any responsibility for the successful failure of such a proposal. Shane, it was interesting hearing your assessment about who's been supportive of this and who hasn't. And I would love to, if we have time in the Q&A section, unpack some of the Labor Party support or not for medical versus recreational cannabis in New Zealand. That's super interesting to me. The significance, the historical and the regional significance of this vote is difficult to overstate in terms of cannabis policy progress, both in Asia Pac and around the world. I think a lot of people are looking to New Zealand as the domino that will cause the effect, the second or third domino in line of, the rest of the countries in the world as far as this kind of drug law reform goes. And I guess it's worth considering, you know, in other countries within the region, you know, where are our politics up to? Where's our policy debate up to with this? And, you know, should New Zealand vote yes on this referendum, and should that legislation be passed? I think it's sort of the received wisdom that will automatically translate into greater public support for this policy area in other jurisdictions. I think that's probably true. If you look at the surveys that have been conducted on Australians about what they think about recreational cannabis, it has been in the last few years that popular support has started to change meaningfully from surveys that were conducted 10 or 20 years ago. That definitely has to do with what's been happening in North America, within the United States, obviously Canada legalizing recreational cannabis not too long ago, only a couple of years or so. I think it also has to do with our passage of our medical cannabis legislation. So although in the short term, it makes sense that some of the public demands for access to cannabis can be met through a medical regime, and implementing a medical cannabis regime might release some of that pressure or divert some of that energy and therefore reduce popular support for recreational cannabis legalization. I think in the long run, a well-functioning medical cannabis framework is a great example of how access to these kinds of products that people have concerns about can be managed in a way that's really responsible and that causes social benefits as opposed to social harms. So in Australia, you know, our parliament, the Greens party at a federal level is the only party that currently supports recreational cannabis legalization. Every other party is pretty much against it, minus some hardcore libertarians on the right wing end of the spectrum. And that's unlikely to change until we have the kind of political combination of factors in New Zealand. You know, a left-wing government needs to needs to build a coalition with a couple of parties that would otherwise not be on board. And how do we do that? And that was, you know, that's an opportunistic sort of experience, I guess, as far as New Zealand goes. So popular, you know, public support for recreational cannabis in Australia is still below a majority. That will continue to increase over the coming years, I expect. And really, I think in Australia, unlike New Zealand, because we're not a unicameral country, we do have an upper house and a lower house, and we have states and territories as well. It's likely that the first push towards legalization change in Australia will come from the states. And of course, you know, for that to happen, we'd be looking at looking at Victoria as the most likely candidate to really be pushing that envelope. And then, of course, you know, the rest of the Asia-Pac region would take a strong lead from those reforms in our countries, I believe. There are plenty of countries, especially our smaller Micronesian neighbours, who are looking for quick solutions to economic issues that they're having, especially in the light of you know, global warming and all these other issues that those countries are facing. I think cannabis is a potentially attractive, if a bit risque, policy option for those countries. And I think outside of those, I think Thailand is probably another one to watch, definitely in the Southeast Asian region. They're making tremendous progress with their medical regime and seem to be turning public support in favour. But look, that's it from me. I'll stop rambling on, and maybe we can have some time for some questions, hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rhys. That was really good and very interesting for me as a pharmacist, definitely hear from Australia in terms of what would happen in the future. So we'll now cover a little bit of questions as well. I can see some coming through already. If the hosts want to also show their lovely faces, and
panelists,
I'll go through some. So the first one I can see is where cannabis has been legalized. What has happened to medical versus recreational cannabis? So possibly Manu or Dr. Hardy, if you want to answer that.
Yeah, I could just touch on
Sure.
Colorado. Saw a small dip. I mean, medical in Colorado is very different to medical in Australia and New Zealand. But Colorado started with medicinal, medical, and then legalized. And there's been a drop, but it's been small. But yeah, it's a very different regime, so it's hard to compare there. I think Canada has seen a larger shift from medicinal to accessing therapeutic products in the recreational, fully legal adult system.
The Canadian model peaked out at about 400,000 medical patients when they allowed adult use in October 2018, and they haven't changed since. So it's peaked at that. I think access is a lot easier, whether it be adult use or medical. Patients can just buy it without having a need to have a doctor's prescription.
Okay. I've got another one. Do you think the promotion of high CBD flower as a benefit of legalization can help with the referendum? So many people do recognize the benefits of CBD, and without legalizing, we are mostly seeing only the THC flower, also untested for harmful toxins. Possibly this could help sway some. Everyone's nodding.
Well, I mean, like the global hype of CBD has been a big part of changing people's attitudes towards cannabis in general, I think. Like, you know, the idea that, hey, actually there's this part of cannabis that is harmless and, you know, maybe very therapeutic and is also really sexy, and, you know, like celebrities love it, and you can rub it on your skin and you can put it on your pillow, and, you know, it's a cure-all. Like, as much as I, you know, as you can probably tell from my voice, you know, dislike some of that narrative, because I find it to be a bit of quackery. You know, more people know about CBD than they know about, you know, a medical cannabis program. So that's been a big part of moving public perception, I think.
I'd like to just chime in a little bit on some pharmacology here about medicinal cannabis and how it's taken. Generally speaking, CBD isn't terribly well absorbed orally, and it needs to be in an oil carrier to really get much in at all. But inhalational CBD is likely to ramp that up. So one of the things that you might see with specially bred flowers with high doses of CBD compared to THC is better absorption, and therefore better pharmacodynamics with higher strength CBD inhalational. So, you know, your oral bioavailability might be somewhere between 6 and 10%. But what if you could ramp that up to somewhere between 11 and 45% by using an inhalational CBD? That means that you wouldn't be needing to prescribe hundreds of milligrams of CBD in order to achieve the same result that you might be able to get at a fraction with an inhalational. And I think that's one of the advantages of looking at an inhalational or especially bred leaf or botanical CBD dominant flower. And that's one thing. Of course, the other thing is the maximization of benefit with the minimization of THC side effects. And so one of the nice things about CBD is its effect on, well, very little, lack of effect, one would say, lack of affinity, and potentially lack of effect when it does bind to any at all to the CB1 or 2 receptors. So low affinity molecule for the receptor. When it may bind, and this is still very uncertain, it's likely to be a partial agonist or antagonist. What that means is that any harmful effects that people may experience from the utilization of THC in that flower can be obviated by the presence of some CBD there. So I would be a supporter of that flower, although there is obviously, as Rhys said, there's a huge amount of catchphrase and advertorial going on with CBD. There are some clear benefits there, and if people were able to access botanical CBD dominant flowers, then I think that they may actually be able to get away with using a lot less, saving a lot of money as well.
The industry body actually went through the process of looking at what's required to get CBD down scheduled from a prescription medicine. And unfortunately, to get it down and outside of the Medicines Act is going to take a huge law change, and you have to be able to justify the safety, and there's a whole lot of caveats in there to do it by the Medicines Act. So in effect, to get over-the-counter CBD, our best shot in the short term is via the referendum. So yeah, there's a lot of interest in CBD products, and there must be massive demand for over-the-counter stuff. And in fact, some of the companies that say they don't want to get into the recreational market do leave that door ajar, saying that they're interested in the wellness products and, you know, over-the-counter CBD formulations. And on top of that, yeah, like you say, the celebrities are getting in on it. And in New Zealand, Ben Franks, that rugby player on my slide, he's actually got a whole range of CBD products that are over the counter back in the United Kingdom. So people like him, you know, sports players and that sort of thing, are probably have a big impact on making people aware of what's possible with CBD.
Can I just sneak a question into some of the New Zealand panelists? The 15% limit on THC, sorry, Dunya, is that too high or too less? I just wanted you to cut your question, answer to that question.
I think it's a good limit for a higher tax bracket. So you might have, you know, different levies based on your potency to drive rookie and heavy users towards lower potency stuff. But I don't think any sort of prohibition of limits is really enforceable. You know, we talk about alcohol problems in New Zealand, but we have absinthe on the shelf at 85% alcohol, and that's not part of the problem. So I think, you know, high strength stuff should be available, but you have to pay through the nose for it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's not like if we only had beer available, we would be able to eliminate alcoholism, right?
Yeah,
like, you just take more.
But touching on the CBD side of things, if we wanted to have a really complicated tax structure or levy structure, you could incentivize higher CBD cultivars as well. So I've talked about it a couple of times with other people, and while it might be a bit to get over the heads of the politicians, from a public health perspective, if the cheaper stuff did have a higher CBD content, again, driving those rookies and heavy users towards the safer stuff, that could have really massive positive health impacts.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few of those sort of features of the draft bill which probably don't make a lot of sense in a scientific or practical perspective, but are there probably as much to kind of placate or just to be a bit of a PR thing. And what I've said to some of the activists who, you know, like, I'm not voting for this if they're going to have that kind of limit on it. It's like, well, yeah, it's incrementalism. This is a step in the right direction. Let's get this over the line, and in time people will realise that you know, if it's 14 grams a day,
imagine it might evolve over time, like speed limits on roads do. You know, it is a subject.
Things change. I mean, yeah, it's a good point. Like, you know, as the New Zealand, you know, the draft bill is as much a political document as it is a policy document or a scientific document, and it is the first cut. You know, it is the first draft of what will be infinite iterations as this scheme, should it get up, you know, evolve over time and be informed by better science as we start learning more.
It also has to go through the whole select committee process, so there's submissions and everything, and there's a lot of fine-tuning to be done if the referendum, and even if the referendum's unsuccessful but close, I think the next government will, you know, there'll be a strong mandate there to do something rather than nothing.
Beautiful. All right, Dr. Hardy, you really wanted to answer this one, so I'll hand it over in terms of driving, like we spoke about already.
I'll open, but I probably won't be the last speaker. In reading the draft documents from New Zealand, it appears that this involves solely the possession and use and the circumstances of the use of cannabis. Can you drive on it? The answer is the rules around driving, the rules around other forms of conduct that are currently legislated differently, like driving under the influence of a drug, will remain the same. So if you're using cannabis in a country where it's illegal to drive on cannabis, and they have means to test, and they test you and you're found to be positive, that won't change. It's a bit like, you know, it's legal to drink, but you know, if you're found to have any alcohol in your system as a provisional driver in Australia, then you're going to end up losing your license. If you're not a provisional driver, then there's a limit on how much alcohol you can have in your system. It's 0.05% pretty much everywhere, and that's I think very similar scenario to other countries. And the cutoff for THC will be 0, I think, in New Zealand, as it has been and shall continue to be. Anyone want to add anything further?
In my research, I was asked to speak on this at the MedCan conference. I read that New Zealand police do a roadside sobriety test, which seems best practice in Canada and other countries. And I think if the golden rule is if you're not impaired, then you should be all right to drive. But if you are impaired, you should abstain from driving for up to 6 hours until you.
Manu and Shane, how is cannabis impaired driving policed at the moment?
Well, it's always been a crime to drive while impaired by any drug, but it's poorly policed, and there's a bit of this drug driving campaign, but quite often it's people that have just been thrown onto the methadone program and haven't tapered and that sort of thing that have actually been causing crashes. And they've had a bit of a media campaign around that with National MP Nick Smith. But my understanding is Julianne Genter from the Greens was trying to get that sorted this year. They're talking about doing mouth swabs. While not perfect, they're a good indicator of fairly recent use. And I think that there's a limit in blood tests for THC. I think it was 50 ng per mil or something like that. Mm-hmm. And, it's pretty low, but it's not zero. So there is, you can smoke on a Friday night and still have a tiny bit of THC detectable on Monday morning, and it's not the end of the world.
Yeah. So are they currently doing random roadside mouth swabs, or is that a policy that's been proposed?
I think that's on the books, but I haven't been pulled over by the cops for years, so I can't report from first-hand experience.
Sure, yeah. Just from Australia is one of the few countries in the world that does random roadside drug tests in general, and I think testing for the presence of cannabis at the roadside, it's littered with so many challenges: scientific, technical, ethical, political. And it's been such a dog's breakfast over here in terms of how that's turned out, and these kinds of rulings that people have been found to be impaired because of a mouth swab that gets overturned in courts, pretty routinely these days. It boggles my mind. What would have to be going through a politician's mind to want to pursue a policy like that has never been shown to work or achieve any policy outcomes that are desirable? It's sort of beyond me. But anyway.
Yeah, the other problem for me is, I'll quickly, Manu, then I'll pass that over to you, is that, there are far more harmful substances that are floating around in people's systems, pharmaceuticals such as opioids and benzodiazepines, which can be equally demonstrated on these tests, but which they don't act upon because they're so-called prescription pharmaceuticals. There's no evidence to say that cannabis is more harmful than an opioid or a benzodiazepine. As Shane pointed out, people on programs where their doses haven't been titrated properly, or who are still utilising illicit opioids while they're on a program, or multiple other drugs. Those are the real dangers to society. I see, as you said, there's not a lot of evidence associated with roadside accidents, roadside deaths in cannabis. It's another one of those harms that gets wheeled out all the time, like the drug-induced psychotic guy in the no ad. And it's very easy to throw these sorts of anecdotal cases up and say, well, this is why we have to do it. If we can save one life, it's all worth it, all the millions of dollars we spent. Well, you might spend billions of dollars trying to save that life. Meanwhile, you're not saving lives elsewhere. You're costing lives down the track. Over to you, Manu.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the employers that we've spoken to are worried about the potential increase in prevalence of using heavy machinery or driving under the influence and things. And I think there just needs to be some more clarity around the existing workplace options. To give, every employer has health and safety responsibilities these days, and so do their directors and boards, and they have their existing policies, and people are still using cannabis now. 80% of New Zealanders have tried it, and a good proportion continue to use it regularly under prohibition. So that's already in place, and they've got those policies, and but it is something that keeps people up at night and could sort of swing them to a no vote. And so I think it just needs to be some more commentary and resources available for employers and employees around what that means in the workplace.
Awesome.
Just on that workplace safety, being a former military man myself, I like to point out that the Canadian Defence Force has a really good policy with 3 levels, and if they can make it so that fighter pilots have rules around when they can and can't use cannabis with their $50 million bit of equipment, I'm pretty sure you can figure out when someone can and can't use the forklift.
All right. We had one more question maybe before we close it up for tonight, but it's been really great so far from all angles. One has been emailed in and they've asked, with concerns that more widespread use of cannabis would lead to more pressure on medical specialists and on public health, both of which are already experiencing workforce shortages and distribution issues. Any thoughts on this?
And the experience from Canada is that they've seen a decrease in youth, young people using cannabis since legalization. So, and not a large increase in adults using. I think there's a little spike just after legalization, and people that haven't tried it or want to sort of try it do so, but not a huge increase. And so potentially it's actually going to have a beneficial effect on particularly youth health services if young people are using it less, because there's more control around it. So I guess that's where the health regulators are coming from on this one.
And if we're looking at social services holistically, the resources and the money that can be saved from policing simple possession of cannabis, if those resources are redirected to youth mental health services, social housing, literally any other policy arena that isn't locking up people for possessing cannabis, the net health system benefit is way in the positive. And we do spend an extraordinary amount of time and money and energy pursuing, prosecuting, and persecuting people who use cannabis or possessing small amounts of cannabis. So yeah, the net benefit is going to be positive.
Those stats that Mark had would be really great to get references to. The first time I'd heard some of them, so if you can share those, Mark.
Absolutely, I'll try and get some to you later. I think the other thing to remember is that even in an illicit market society like we have here in Australia, age of first use of cannabis is somewhere between 14 and 16. I think if you put an age limit of 20, whilst there'll be concerns that someone will always try and supply a younger person with cannabis, or someone will jump over the back fence and nick someone's plants and then start selling them and smoking them. That stuff's going on now. There's absolutely no regulation to that can stop that, even though there are regulations that prohibit it. The notion that this is suddenly going to open up a hotbed of cannabis users in the under 20 group, when the average age of first use of cannabis in Australia and New Zealand is about 16, which means some are starting at 12 and 13 and some are starting at 18 or 20. It's false logic to think that by introducing a small legalized aliquot or portion of cannabis for people is somehow going to create an explosion of youth cannabis use disorders. It's not going to be the driver or the determinant for that, because the people who've started using cannabis early generally have social determinants and biological and physical and psychological determinants that lead them to using cannabis early, rather than just the presence or availability of cannabis in a legal or illegal market.
Awesome. Thank you so much to everyone that has joined us for tonight. I hope you all have learned a little bit as well from the other speakers. I definitely have. And thank you for everyone listening from home or wherever you are in the world. So we'll wrap it up for tonight.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Really.